Marci, welcome back to the podcast.
Oh, thank you for inviting me back, Scott.
I remember our last conversation really fondly about your book, The Ukrainian Night. And you know what I just found today, which I've subscribed to? I can take your course
Oh,
on
yes, you
modern
can.
European intellectual history after Nietzsche. Nietzsche is my favorite philosopher. And I've subscribed. So I'm gonna audit this course, and maybe you can come back and we could talk a little European history next time.
Oh, I would be thrilled.
But today we're talking about one of your specialties, the Ukraine, which you last time you were on the show, you wrote about, we talked about your book, The Ukrainian Night, which is an intimate history of the revolution of 2014. There a lot has happened since then, and Friday, I think, we saw something really unusual in the Oval Office, where we had President Zelensky sitting with President Trump and Vice President Vance, and it was a really unusual interaction, and it has taken the world by storm. I mean, the war in Ukraine, of course, has been on and off people's radar since the invasion, the Russian invasion in 2022, but now this is really fresh in our minds because we saw an interaction that I've not seen anything like in recent American history. What were you think before we get into? I'd really like to just spend the time getting the kind of knowledge Americans would need to really contextualize what's going on in Ukraine and what stake we have in it. But just personally, when you saw, I'm sure you've watched at least part of this interaction. What were you, as someone who knows people in Ukraine, is committed part of your life to studying this? What were you thinking? What were you feeling?
I think I still don't have words to fully express the extent of the shame and disgust and horror I felt watching that grotesque scene play out in the Oval Office. The phrase that kept coming to me was, "There is no bottom." There is no bottom in this administration. You think that things cannot get any worse and more despicable and morally abhorrent, and then they do. There's aphorism I like to quote in Polish, which is, "I found myself at the very bottom, and then I heard knocking from below." And I feel that a lot, and I did not think I could be shocked anymore by anything this administration was going to do. But watching that footage on Friday, I felt shocked, and before I did the first interview, I had to really take a deep breath and think, okay, I have to not sound hysterical because it was such a visceral sense of shame and disgust.
I'm wondering, it's very interesting. Zelensky, I mean, the contrast with the British Prime Minister, who kind of came in and did the fawning, right? Who had the king has invited you to, and this is unprecedented, historical, singular, used every adjective, he used all these adjectives, which Trump loves, right? Well, Trump actually loves the adverb, right? I imagine it's the only part of speech he studied in school, because very powerfully, very strongly, beautifully, amazingly. I mean, powerfully and strongly. It's very unusual. But he fawned
off. Great imitation. That's a great Trump.
I do another podcast where I do a lot of Trump, and it's really bizarre because it gets to you after you do it for a while. But but I mean, Zelensky chose to not come in and sort of do the fawning exercise, right? I mean, he really put forth, some concerns, right? I mean, he was concerned about signing a deal that wouldn't include security concerns, right? Which are kind of, I guess, in the Budapest Accords and stuff back years ago, where we said, hey, if you give up your nukes, we'll take care of you. We'll make sure you don't get run over, right?
And that was worth about as much as the paper it was printed on.
I mean, so I mean, do you think Zelensky's posture? I mean, what do you make of that? What do you make of Zelensky's posture in the Oval Office? I mean, do you think that came out of anxiety, suspicion? What do you think? Not that you could read his mind, but I'm saying, what did you see when you saw it,
I
watched it?
thought he did an extraordinarily good job under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. There were so many things stacked against him. One of which is that he is a man who is responsible for the lives of the people in the country, and people are being slaughtered, by Russian soldiers who are terrorizing and shelling, and murdering people and throwing them into torture chambers and tying them to boards and electrocuting them with electric shocks. And he is responsible for that every single day. The world is not a game to him like it is to Trump, and he came in there understanding the stakes. I thought he came in there with an enormous amount of composure, given that he knew that this was likely going to be a setup against him. He put himself in this situation. He felt that he had to. He was at a huge structural disadvantage linguistically as well. And hopefully my friend Amelia Glazier will write about this from the perspective of a translator. Had I been advising Zelensky, I would have pushed him to use an interpreter. You're always at a huge structural disadvantage speaking your non-native language, which most Americans fail utterly to appreciate because we're a monolingual country and most people have no experience of what that means and how difficult it is. Zelensky,
I think particularly too. Do you think particularly? I mean, I thought what he said about the oceans, like you have your nice ocean, that seemed to me, I mean, to be actually a profound point. What I heard him trying to say was that you can't have this isolationist framework, right? That you think, oh, it's over there. It won't. It'll affect United States security and interests. You can't just look at the Ukraine as some remote part of the world, right? I mean, but he kind of, I think had he had a translator, maybe would that have come through more clearly?
I think everything would have come through more clearly and simply sounded more impressive. I thought it sounded very impressive as it was, given how sharp he was and how he continued to respond and even respond with some humor, given that he had these bullies stacked up against him. But I should also add that Zelensky 3 years ago basically didn't speak English. And the fact that he has learned English, in the midst of this war and is speaking it publicly in situations with the very highest stakes is extraordinary. But his English isn't like the English of Yatsenuk or Dmytro Kuleba or a lot of these other, Ukrainian political commentators and politicians who really spent a lot of time abroad in English-speaking countries and who really have fluent English. So he's doubly at a disadvantage in that sense. But even so, he was following everything, and he was throwing the ball back the whole time. And Trump's like, you don't have any cards. You're not holding any cards. And Zelensky says, we're not playing cards, which is actually a very profound moment in the exchange. Because for Trump, everything is a game. Everything is a deal. Everything is a spinning of the wheel on the casino. Everything is a chance to humiliate someone. Everything is a performance. Zelensky knows very well that this is not a game. That the stakes are life and death at every single moment. And so you have a confrontation between two men, one of whom is a moral nihilist for whom nobody's life means anything at all, and one of whom is actually living in the real world where life is not just a game and not just a performance, and feels the weight of all of those lives for whom he's responsible.
You say we're not playing cards. And I was thinking about when Trump said, you don't have any cards. I was just rereading Joseph Ellis, one of Joseph Ellis's books on the founding fathers, wonderful 18th century political historian. And he makes this great point that Washington didn't have any cards, right? He just knew if he could keep the Continental Army alive, it wasn't about taking territory. It wasn't about winning battle. It was keeping the army alive and keeping resolve alive, right? And so I just think, would Trump have said to Washington, look, George, you don't have any cards. Okay, they got a big king. We've got redcoats. Okay. I mean, oftentimes, right, you can't reduce things, right, to, and the Ukrainians seemingly have done remarkably well. I mean, with against a larger country with one of with historic military force. I mean, right, they've exceeded expectations militarily.
They've exceeded expectations exponentially. I think it was true that nobody thought they had more than a few days in the beginning. And remember that moment in the exchange where Trump's like, oh, you wouldn't have had 2 weeks without us. And Zelensky's like, yes, 3 days. I know, Putin said 3 days. Um, it was amazing what they did. I mean, Zelensky is not a perfect person. He's not a perfect president. There are no such people. But the decision that Zelensky made on February 24th, 2022, when the Americans offered to evacuate him, and there are assassination squads sent by the FSB in Kiev ready to take him out and take his family out, and he goes out onto the street at night with these 3 guys from his presidential administration and records that selfie video, and says, we are here. I, the president, am here. We are not running away. We're going to defend our country. Now, that was a historic moment. If they had not done that, if Zelensky had not done that, we would all be living in a different world now. That was a true act of courage, and whatever happens henceforth, there needs to be some recognition of that. I mean, I think we should be thanking the Ukrainians for fighting the Russians essentially by themselves, even if with our weapons, and thereby staving off World War III, as opposed to constantly asking them to kind of pay tribute to us.
Yeah, you say that, and I think for some reason you always interpret everything through or at least I do, right, through the last book you read or the last thing you're thinking about. And Ellis is still in my head, and I think about how desperate things looked in the 18th century for these colonists fighting the fiercest fighting force at that point in history the world had ever seen. I mean, the British Army at this point is just unbelievable, and yet they prevailed, and in it ignited a quest and a thirst for liberty in the world. And it's so interesting that my friends on the right, who tend to romanticize the country's founding, don't see parallels between our struggle for freedom and to have a constitutional republic and what's going on in the Ukraine. I mean, we should have a natural affinity, right, for this in this post-Soviet world for people that are in a similar situation as Americans were in their founding, right?
That is an interesting point that you make. And I can say that for me as a historian, the situation Ukraine is now is relatively unusual historically in its moral clarity. Most of the time, violent situations are much murkier, not always, but often. But the situation in which you have now, in which you have an unprovoked invasion, an army comes across the border of a sovereign state, starts mass shelling of cities, mass slaughter of civilians, targeting of residential buildings, of kindergartens, of maternity hospitals, of children's hospitals, sets up torture facilities everywhere that they occupy for no reason. And this is historically very unusual in its moral clarity. There's nothing really to think about in that sense. Again, the point is not that Ukraine has always been a perfect country or a perfect nation. The point is that you have mass terror being carried out. I mean, think about what happened to the Jews during the Second World War. It was not that Jews everywhere had always been perfect people carrying out a perfect culture and nobody had ever done anything not nice or imperfect or compromising. But what did they do to deserve being mass slaughtered? And this is what's going on for the Ukrainians. I mean, this is why for me, when people say, why can't the Ukrainians just negotiate? Why can't you just give some of this territory to Putin? I mean, really, who cares what side of the border Bakhmut's on? I mean, who's ever been to Bakhmut? Who's heard of Bakhmut? These are little places in the middle of nowhere in this post-Soviet mining region. I understand why this is not the same kind of question for Ukrainians, because for them, it's not about the territory, it's about the people. Everyone who is living under Russian occupation is living under a reign of terror. So you have to ask yourself, if this were 1942 or 1943, could we have done a peace deal with Hitler and the Third Reich in which some portion of the European Jewish population remained under Nazi occupation? Would that have been a morally sustainable solution?
Yeah, when I look at this situation, I think I put this on Twitter the other day. I said, when Trump talks about this, he seems like he thinks about it like a guy breaking up a bar fight, more like that, and less like a home invasion, right? where I mean, who when somebody invades your home and holds you at gunpoint, is Trump going to come in and say, okay, look, let him sleep with your wife. Let him take the big screen. You can keep the iMac, okay? You can keep the. He's taking the microwave. It's a good deal. You're still gonna get your house. I mean, yeah. And what moral universe should Russia get anything, right? And what does it say to the world? I mean, I just listened to Rahm Emanuel talk about this. He said, when he was ambassador to Japan, they spent a lot of time pleading with North Korea and cajoling and saying, hey, look, don't go nuclear. I mean, we know you have a fierce adversary on your border, but don't go nuclear. And what message does this say if we pull back? Yeah, get the nukes. Everybody, you want your nukes, because it just strikes me. Do you think this will cause a renewed global proliferation?
I fear that it will. I also think that I think Biden's logic was wrong. I think Biden was way too cautious. The restrictions on American weapon use across the border, the reluctance to give more weapons faster, I think that had fatal consequences. I'm not a military expert by any means, but my sense is that if we had just given them everything, no holds barred, in 2022, right away, this could have been over. There was incredible momentum during the counteroffensive in the fall of 2022. But there was and Biden, I mean, Trump is a moral nihilist. He just does not care about other people's lives. Biden is not. I think Biden does care about other people's lives and sometimes makes the wrong decisions, but not out of callousness. And he is really afraid of nuclear war, which is a reasonable fear. But my sense is that Putin's nuclear saber rattling is simply one more reason why that regime has to be brought down absolutely and decisively. We are all held hostage to that kind of nuclear threat until that regime falls. It's a 1945 kind of moment. It has to be over. It has to be completely over. There has to be a Stunde Null. There has to be a total reset in Russia.
Let me ask you this: when people hear the term Ukraine, I mean, I often think when let's say you're studying Reformation history or something, and you hear like Luther was German. I mean, Germany, there wasn't Germany then, right? I mean, the way we think of, we've got this modern liberal nation state. That's that's kind of that's a much more recent phenomenon, right? Even the United States, right? Were we something different after the Civil War than before the Civil War? Yeah, certainly. And certainly something different after the Civil Rights Movement, where we have more enfranchisement in the citizenry. And so when an American is looking at this and talking about this Oval Office explosion and this strange turn of events about this war that maybe they've been following on and off, when they hear the term Ukraine, what do they need to know that probably might not be on their radar? I mean, what sort of kind of thing, if you were talking to college sophomores or something, I mean, that don't have a background, what would you say? Like, these are like a few things you need to keep in mind to contextualize the day's events.
Well, there are a couple angles I can answer that from. Let me start from an American angle, and then I can move on to an angle from the point of view of a historian of Eastern Europe. So about 3 years ago, shortly, 3 years ago in the spring, not that long after the full-scale invasion began, I was doing a briefing for a Democratic congressperson and the Washington staff. And these were people who were smart, they were competent, they were not experts on the region, but they were really trying to figure it out. And I was trying in the hour or so that I had to approach from different angles how to understand the relationship between Ukraine and Russia. Because of course they had been part of the Soviet Union in recent history. The Soviet Union breaks up in 1991, Ukraine gets its independence, there's a series of revolutions, there's a lot to be said. And then spontaneously, trying to make it somehow more relatable, I pulled out of the air, as historians sometimes do, this analogy. And analogies are never perfect, but they're useful as hermeneutic and heuristic devices. And so I said, okay, imagine this is 2022. Imagine January 6th had gone the other way. And imagine we were now living in a Trumpist dictatorship. And under the guise of making America great again, Trump decides to send the American army across the border to invade Canada. So suppose the American army shows up and just starts shelling Toronto and carrying out mass slaughter of civilians. Now, Canada's a bilingual country like Ukraine, but really everybody speaks English there, even if it's not their first language, they also speak English. And they eat hamburgers and French fries, and we eat hamburgers and French fries. And really, you don't feel like such a dramatic cultural difference. It's a different political culture. They have different political traditions. But if you kind of hung out and went to restaurants and the movies, you wouldn't feel like it was so foreign. Lots of Americans study at Canadian universities and vice versa. There are lots of families split.
A few more apologies, a lot more I'm sorry's, but other than a few apologies,
a little
very
more
similar.
Polite, right?
Yeah.
There's some
cultural. Have to learn how to like hockey. It's
exactly
cold.
Right. They're more into hockey. We're more into football. But, but basically, like, there are lots of cultural linguistic similarities. So would anybody say if the American army were to show up and start shelling Toronto and slaughtering people, well, really, why would they mind? I mean, after all, we're so similar. We're one people. Like, isn't it just the same? And at the time that I pulled this analogy out, for this congresswoman and her Washington staff, it was so effective precisely because it was absolutely inconceivable and unimaginable 3 short years ago that the United States would ever think of invading Canada. Now 3 years later, here we are. I'm not even sure what to say about that because it's so grotesque. But that's not that is one way to understand the relationship. There are real cultural linguistic similarities. They are also two different countries, and one of the ways the distinction comes out is in different political cultures, and that is not something that was genetically determined from time immemorial. This is not an ethnic conflict, and Ukraine is not primarily an ethnic nation. What has changed in Ukraine and what has developed in Ukraine remarkably, over the course of the 30-some years it's now been an independent state, is really the coming into being of a civic nation. That Ukrainian is now a political identity. There are many, many Ukrainians, including many Ukrainians on the front line who are ethnic Russians. Many people have relatives on both sides of the border. There are Jews, there are Tatars, there are Muslims. Ukraine has really taken on a political identity and a civic identity. And a lot of that was contingent, and it has to do with the experience that Ukrainians have had, through various protest movements and revolutions and political transformations and struggles and grappling with post-Soviet corruption over the course of the past 30 years. And so the connections between Russia and Ukraine culturally and linguistically are real, but that does nothing to make the carrying out of mass atrocity and the invasion of a sovereign state any less outrageous.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Again, all this stuff from my recent reading is still in my head, but I think about the 18th century in this country. There were not Americans per se. You had Virginians and folks from Massachusetts and my state, Pennsylvania, right? Pennsylvanians. People didn't think of themselves as one thing, right? I mean, there wasn't. So that's interesting that this consciousness has emerged out of what you're saying, out of struggle and desire for a liberal sort of small L future, right? A liberal democratic future.
Nobody has done so much to kill the love for the Russian language and Russian culture and Russian affinity in Ukraine as Putin. People who are the very best of the Russophone Ukrainian authors are giving up Russian. And for a writer to give up their native language, it's like cutting off an arm. And it's a sacrifice of, in some sense, the thing that is most intimate and means the most. Nothing was wrong with nothing. There was no oppression of the Russian language in Ukraine. There was no oppression of Russian speakers in Ukraine, of Russian literature, of any of these things. Now people hear the word Pushkin and cringe, which was not the case, 10 or 15 years ago. Putin has killed that. It didn't have to be this way.
So if you were going to sort of list for the average American who doesn't have a lot of background, 3 or 4 moments in Ukrainian history to understand, look, this is how we got here.
Mhm.
What would you say? Like, these are the things that you can, Google, look on Wikipedia. If you just did a quick Wikipedia read, you'd really get a better handle on where we're at right now.
Wow. Well, if we go back to the Soviet period, and there's so much to say about the coming into being of the Soviet Union, the Bolshevik Revolution, and how.
By the way, I understand that Trump now is going to contact MGM and require that they change Rocky IV so that the Russian wins at the end. That's the next move of the foreign policy direction we're in.
I mean, it was so insane. It's like saying I'm the Manchurian candidate, and I'm announcing that I'm the Manchurian candidate.
Exactly.
Announce to everybody that you are working for Putin. And this is all it's all laid bare for everybody to see now. Whatever the hold is Putin has over him, it's now laid bare for everybody to see. But one thing I can mention, that, first of all, to be anywhere in the Soviet Union, which was a huge country composed of 15 different republics that existed from 1922 to 1991, was to be in a terrifying and brutal situation. It's not as if to be in the Russian Soviet Republic was, everything was nice and dandy and safe and calm, but to be in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was horrible. But there were certain experiences that Ukrainians, that are in the immediate historical memory of Ukrainians. One of which is the famine that happened in the 1930s. And that the famine had to do with collectivization. So one of the things that happened when Stalin consolidated power, and especially beginning in 1928, 1929, was collectivization. And collectivization involved taking away all of the private property, all of the animals, all of the livestock from peasants, and forcing them onto collective farms. And in Ukraine, where there was a stronger tradition of private farming, there was particular resistance to collectivization. It was done brutally. It was done by force. Peasants were forced onto collective farms. But what happens after that is that, as a combination of, well, there are a few things. One of which is that, so the deal is, everybody works on this collective farm, and then there are grain quotas that have to be delivered to Moscow. And this was at a time when an allegedly workers' revolution had been carried out in a country that basically didn't have an industrial working class. The Bolshevik Revolution, when it was carried out in 1917, was a revolution not of workers or by workers, but on behalf of a metaphysical proletariat that was yet to come into being. So
this is what people don't understand about Marx, right? That Marx imagined not peasant farmers and agrarian societies like China or Russia having a revolution. He thought it would be late stage capitalism, right?
Exactly,
Where his dream, sort of fertile ground for this, would have been the United Kingdom or the United States,
yes,
where capitalism has taken root and advanced and created greater inequality, right? He didn't think that an agrarian peasant, that wouldn't be you wouldn't have enough development to have the revolution.
No, and that was like the peasant class was supposed to have died out and converted to the proletariat by the time there was workers coming to workers' consciousness. And Marx was coming. Marx knew Germany, Marx knew Paris, Marx knew London. This was, he was coming from a totally unrepresentative part of the world where industrial capitalism was actually developed. So the fact that you have, Lenin comes in with this idea that history can be rushed. That yes, history is moving inevitably, inexorably in a given direction, but we can nudge it a bit. Leninism is all about nudging history. It's about rushing history. So you can argue that this was the original sin of the Bolshevik Revolution. You carry out this workers' revolution on behalf of this metaphysical proletariat that has yet to come into being. So what do you need to do? You need to jumpstart industrialization, and create a working class. And so Stalin has this idea that you're going to sell the grain being produced in Russia, in Ukraine, in Kazakhstan, and Ukraine is the breadbasket in particular. You're going to sell it abroad for hard currency, which is going to give you the resources needed to build the factories that will allow you to jumpstart industrialization. So there was always the idea that you're going to take from the peasants to create the industrial class. And then that is compounded by the combination of one very good harvest harvest in the early 1930s, which then leads to an unrealistic projection of grain quotas for the following year, together with then poor weather conditions and unusually poor harvest, and you get mass starvation. You get mass starvation in the countryside, centrally, but not exclusively in Ukraine, also in Kazakhstan, also in Western Russia, but millions of Ukrainian peasants starve to death. There's cannibalism in the countryside. This is what the Ukrainians call the Holodomor. This is the death, the genocide by starvation. They have not forgotten about this. And the historical debate is as to whether Ukrainians in particular were deliberately targeted because Stalin particularly didn't like Ukrainians and saw them as a source of resistance to the Bolshevik project, or whether it was simply convenient that, okay, there was a bad harvest, we want the grain, we are going to collect every last bit of grain, including the seed grain, and we don't care if the peasants starve. So either Stalin was indifferent or it was intentional. And there's a historical debate about you need very conscious intentionality in order to make a genocide claim. I think that question is not so relevant, as is the fact that this is what happened, and Stalin was perfectly happy and content to let it go on. So there's that experience, of everybody in Ukraine knows people who were victims, of the mass starvation in the 1930s. There was also, during the Stalinist purges, there was a decapitation of the artistic and cultural elite. So there were, people like Kulish and like Semenko and the, Kurbash and the best theater directors and artists and poets, who fell victim to the Stalinist terror. And the Stalinist terror affected basically everyone everywhere, but there was a particular targeting at a certain moment of the Ukrainian artistic and intellectual elite, which is now called the executed Renaissance. You lose a whole generation of writers and of artists and of thinkers, and those things have not been forgotten. There's Chernobyl, which has also not been forgotten. Chernobyl, the accident at Chernobyl, which was about which there was much dissimulation initially before the dissimulation became impossible because the radiation was spreading beyond the borders. And then since 1991, there have been a series of reform attempts, protest movements, and finally a real revolution in 2013, 2014, that was part of a coming of age of a Ukrainian nation that was really a civic nation.
It's really interesting. I saw a poll recently of Gen Zers in the UK, 50% of which thought that the UK needs a strong man, right? That's not held back by parliament. I mean, this sort of authoritarian impulse is so strong. I wonder, despite my wonderful boyish good looks, I remember I grew up in an era where there was a Soviet Union, right? I remember the fall of communism. There are people in Ukraine, right, that don't remember the Soviet Union. I'm wondering, what's the difference among Ukrainians for which the Soviet Union is something in history books, and Ukrainians for whom that was an everyday reality?
Huge. And I think that's true everywhere. I think the generational split is huge. And that's one of the differences, by the way, between Putin's regime, and Zelensky's government. These are much younger people. These were people who still had childhoods during the Soviet time, but really came of age and were formed by post-Soviet times. And that's an enormous difference. It was an enormous difference, in what triggered the revolution of 2013, 2014. That gets started because Yanukovych, who was the gangster dictator type at the time, had been set to sign an association agreement with the European Union. And the association agreement was not perfect. It would have involved Ukraine undertaking costly reforms. It clearly would have provoked retaliation from the Kremlin. And at the end of the day, it did not promise that Ukraine would be accepted into the EU. But it was hugely important as a symbolic step and a foot in the door, in the sense that Ukraine had an intention of moving towards Europe, and that Europe potentially was open to accepting Ukraine. And this was when when Yanukovych, at the 11th hour, when the signing ceremony has already been prepared, and suddenly on November 21st, 2013, he says, no, I'm not going to sign it. And at that point, a 32-year-old Afghan-Ukrainian journalist, then 32 years old, Mustafa Naim, puts out a Facebook post saying, hey guys, let's be serious. If you're really upset, come out to the Maidan, the big square in the center of Kiev, by midnight tonight. Likes don't count. And people came out, and not exclusively, but overwhelmingly students and young people, because the stakes of the EU agreement mattered so much more to people who were about to start university, who were at university, who wanted to be able to learn languages, to study abroad, to go on exchanges, to do internships in Brussels, to work for international corporations. They wanted the world to be open to them. They were aware of that world. They felt like they wanted to be part of that world. They didn't want to spend their lives spending days standing in line, humiliating themselves, waiting for visas. They wanted the world to be open to them as well. And there were many people in Ukraine who were older, who were retired, who were formed by Soviet times, who were not interested in learning foreign languages, who lived further in the east or closer to the border, for whom that was just not a significant issue at all. And so it was overwhelmingly students who come out, and their slogan in the beginning is Ukraine is Europe. And that's it. Like, they're not interested in ethnic politics. They're not interested in language politics. They're not interested in the opposition political parties. It's Ukraine is Europe, and that was very much a generational issue. And the whole thing might have fizzled out had not Yanukovych, it seems under pressure from Putin, decide that he's going to send out his goons to brutally beat up the students after about 10 days of peaceful protest. And I think Yanukovych was then counting on the fact that the parents are going to freak out because there has not been an act of mass violence by the government against the domestic population since 1991. So the parents are going to freak out and they're going to pull their kids off the street. And that's where Yanukovych makes a mistake, because instead of pulling their kids off the street, the parents decide to join them there. And the grandparents decide to join them there. And so you go from having several hundred or a couple thousand people on the Maidan to a day and a half later, you have between 500,000 and 1 million people on the streets. No one has ever seen that many people on the streets of Kiev before. And now they're not just shouting, Ukraine is Europe. Now the slogan is, we will not let you beat our children. And that was that was an extraordinary moment. And for me, above all, it wasn't about the coming together of the Russian and Ukrainian speakers or the Uniates and the Orthodox or the Jews and it was above all and most profoundly about this overcoming of Oedipal rebellion and this unification of generations against arbitrary violence, against being treated as a humiliated thing and not as an active subject by their own government. It was an extraordinary moment to witness as a kind of coming of age, of coming into being of a civic nation, that unification of generations.
I'm curious, there's a controversial book written several years ago. This is back in the 80s, right? The Clash of Civilizations, the whole Huntington, right? Where he largely thinks that after he calls the age of ideology has ended, where it was sort of capitalism versus communism was the large global fault line. He thought that you'd have civilizational conflicts, and he divides the world up into several civilizations. If my listeners don't know the book, and one of them is sort of Western Europe, which he thinks is Christian and oh, sorry, my internet went out there for a second.
Okay, I lost your
yeah, and he has that he says that basically after the age of ideology, all the conflicts will be in borders ends, will be in places where there are two civilizations up against each other. He predicts former Yugoslavia. Ukraine is one of the predictors. He says that this will be one of the fault lines because it's not quite part of the Russian civilization, nor is it quite part of that European Western Christian civilization. It's in between and a multi-ethnic kind of reality. And that, I mean, Huntington, I mean, that book used to be banned and now it seems more and more relevant. But Ukraine is in this in kind of unique liminal situation, right? Where it is kind of trying, it is trying to figure out where it fits civilizationally. Is that a fair way to frame it, or is that unhelpful?
Well, definitely liminality has been important. The sense of being, between and on the borders. And it's an issue I've always been fascinated by. Like Isaac Deutscher has this famous essay, The Non-Jewish Jew, where he argues that it's precisely liminality. It's precisely this situation of being on the borders of different cultures and different civilizations that gives one an epistemological advantage. I mean, I would add that I'm very against essentializing. I think that the development of Ukraine is not.
And for our listeners who don't know that, who don't teach European intellectual history, like essentialism just means basically saying that being Russian is this thing, right? You can boil it to the essence of this, or being American is this, or Christianity is this one thing, right? So you're saying essentialism tends to oversimplify and make something complex into one thing, right?
And it makes things static too. It assumes that there's some kind of essence that continues through time. I think the development of Ukraine was very contingent. I think the development of Russia was contingent. I mean, one of the things, what captured me and fascinated me about the revolution on the Maidan, and why I ended up writing a book about it, despite the fact that historians are really only good when we've got some time to look back in retrospect. We're not very good at thinking in real time, because you can never know in real time what you can know looking back.
What does Hegel say, right? The owl of Minerva.
Exactly.
Only spreads its wings at dusk.
Precisely, and we cling to that because in many ways it's true. You just can never know in real time what you can know, both because you can never gather the sources fast enough and because you don't know how things will play out. But what so captivated me about the Maidan was I saw people changing in front of me. Like I saw that this was not just a political transformation, it was an existential transformation. People came out of this experience of revolution different, and that's a remarkable thing. There's a book that just came out now I'm much more of, as you know, I'm an intellectual historian. I don't do systematic sociological research, but there's a team of sociologists and political scientists, including Olga Onuk and Henry Hale and Volodymyr Kulik, on both sides of the ocean, who were doing large-scale sociological research about changes in Ukrainian society and in political culture. And one of the things they found was that attitudes towards democratic engagement, towards elections, towards civic duty, towards civic identity changed enormously, in the course of the past several years. And I think to me, that is a cause of hope for all of us, the fact that people can change, societies can change. And there are many people now who feel that Russia was always doomed. There's never been democracy in Russia. Nothing else ever could have happened except a fall into another form of tyranny and another form of totalitarianism. I like to think that, that is empirically what did happen, what has happened. But I'm not convinced that there were not other paths.
When you said, I'm laughing because I remember listening to or watching some documentary, and somebody was pushing back on Putin in one of his plans, and somebody just explained to this person in the government, he said, look, he is czar, you are the serf. and sometimes that consciousness, right, where that's the argument, right? It doesn't matter what you call it, there's going to be a czar, right? and Putin's the czar. But you're saying that's not inevitable. People change, ideas change, right? Consciousness can change.
What we're seeing in the United States is in some ways the reverse of that. 2016, the day after the elections, and I was at Yale, I was in New Haven, so I did not know anyone who was supporting Trump. But there was still very quickly a split into what I would call the neurotic catastrophist camp, in which I put myself, and the more composed camp of many of my friends and colleagues who were going around saying, okay, this is bad. This is very bad. But, we are the world's strongest liberal democracy. We drink in our liberal democracy with our mother's milk. We have the world's most stable democratic liberal institutions, we have checks and balances. Breathe in, checks and balances. Breathe out, checks and balances. Checks and balances became like a yoga mantra. There was a sense of this is fundamental in American culture. Certain kinds of liberalism, of democratic guarantees, the rule of law is fundamental in American culture. It can't just break down like it could other places. We are the land of the free and the home of the brave. And as a historian, I felt like, my God, we're like people on the Titanic saying our ship can't sink. We've got the best ship, we've got the strongest ship, we've got the fanciest ship. And what you know as a historian is that any ship can sink. There is no such thing as a ship that cannot sink. And so it works in reverse too. There's no guarantee that things will not fall apart. But I also think that it was not foreordained that things had to go the way they went in Russia. What happened was a contingent development of two different places, in which neo-totalitarianism took hold in one, and an increasingly strong, self-aware, conscious of its own subjectivity, civil society took hold in another.
It's interesting. I was actually listening to a podcast sometime, it's fairly recently. It doesn't matter when, and it was your husband was on the show, Timothy Snyder, and he was talking about the difference in history and memory, right? Because often we need historians. People just know, right? Anybody that knows a police detective in their family or friends just know memory is pretty unreliable, right? And it's not just recollection. We're active in our memory. Our subconscious works on us, our wants, our desires. We shape memory in pretty subjective ways, right? And sometimes we need history to keep memory honest, right? That's why we need people like you that make the big bucks in New Haven, Connecticut, right? To remind us, right, of where maybe our memory is wishful thinking. No?
That's definitely true, and that's always been true. I mean, now we are in, I would say, historical memory and our tendency to want to remember things differently and to want to romanticize certain things and make things more black and white, that has always been an issue. Everyone always wants to think they were innocent and evil came from outside. That's always been an issue. This particular moment of post-truth in which we have a total unhinging from empirical reality by people like Putin and Trump, this does seem new to me. I mean, this was something I first started to observe in 2013, 2014, watching Russia and Ukraine. And when Trump came on the scene a year or so later, I recognized it sooner, I think, than most Americans, only because I had been paying attention to what was happening in Russia and Ukraine. So now this world in which there really, is no, for people like Trump and there really is no more truth. The Ukrainian writer
is this the postmodern experiment getting out of the lab, though, right?
Yes,
because relativism, right? By that I mean relativism comes about for liberative ends, right? For people saying, look, it's not just a white male perspective, it's not just a European perspective. There are lots of ways to look at reality, and we're creating, not just interpreting. And if we get that, we'll get more seats at the table, and we'll have a more expansive conversation about history and reality and politics. But sort of then I remember like it was yesterday, Kellyanne Conway on Chuck Todd's show when she says, well, I have alternative facts.
Yes.
Right. And he says, there's not such thing. That's a falsehood. But it's almost like Trump and people like Steve Bannon. No, I don't think Trump would be able to explain this. Bannon could, because that guy reads books, right? I mean, I think he probably knows what he's doing, right? There's the weaponization of postmodern philosophy to sort of say this is the reality, right? It's and the irony is now you have progressives saying we need old school objectivity, right?
Yes. No, and that's something I've written about, and I'm preoccupied with. I continue to write about it as an intellectual historian. How did a philosophical move that originates very much in the critical sensibility of the left, as a defense against the absolutist claims to truth of 20th century totalitarianism, how does that become a weapon in the hands of the right? That was obviously not the intention. And I'm not saying that Derrida should go to hell for this, but this is precisely what's happened. I mean, you get this kind of nihilism that the Ukrainian writer Alexander Mikhed, wrote recently in The Guardian. He's like, right before our eyes, a world order is being formed in which truth as a category does not exist. I mean, you can look at Jasmine Crockett, yelling in the Congress. She's like, "Is there anybody in here that has enough courage to say Russia invaded Ukraine?
Right,
It's not Ukraine that invaded Russia. That is there anybody who believes in facts? And she sounds like a radical. She sounds like a radical, and all she's saying is there's an empirical reality out there. Can we at least begin the discussion
and even little
of that?
And the victory of this, right? The victory of Trump and Putin and the great relativization revolution here is things like, Trump says, look, we gave you like $360 billion. It was like 119 or something. And nobody says, not one reporter in there said, if Joe Biden had said, if any other, normally, this is just, there's such an onslaught, as Bannon said, keep it at muzzle velocity. There's such an onslaught of bullshit that you can't. That the journalists don't even check it anymore. They just so these things just stand right. And Trump knows, right? You get the falsehood in the air, and you say, "Well, that's your fact. These are my facts." And the 360 billion number now just lives in the ether, and it takes so much longer to correct something once it's in the ether, right? You're the historian, Marci. How do we win? How do we fight back? You're teaching undergrads. How do we keep the kids in the game for democracy?
No, I mean, in some ways, like I find myself going back to this very conservative move and to a certain extent of dissonant philosophy of the 70s and 80s and saying you have to go back to truth. You have to go back to the fact that there is a distinction between truth and falsehood. There was this New Yorker satire in 2016, early 2016, that was about the Republican, the fact checker who passes out from exhaustion at the end of the Republican debate. And there's nobody to replace him, which is funny, but it's not really funny because you're right. Like publications had fact checkers and journalists were ready to fact check individual facts. But when you have such a total unhinging from empirical reality, nobody can possibly keep up. Oh, they're eating the cats and dogs. They're eating your pets. I mean, you don't even know where to start. Oh, it was the Ukrainians that started the war. Oh, it's, 300 and some billion dollars. Oh, it's, we have our alternative fact. You're so overwhelmed, that people just give up on even thinking that the distinction matters. And until you go back, I mean, one of the things I try to talk to students about is that, there's moral philosophy. We can talk about moral philosophy in order to have a basis to make judgments about good and evil, we need a basis of a distinction between truth and falsehood. Because without that, we have no ground to stand on. We have to be able to look at the reality in which we're living, with eyes wide open, and here we are in this situation, which everything is a setup, everything is a performance. There's no distinction between reality and television. Anything can be pulled out of a hat, at any given moment, and nobody has any ground to stand on in that situation.
Do you know Frankfurt's book on bullshit?
No, I don't.
He was a philosopher at Princeton University, but it's a great little book. It's less than 100 pages.
I've heard of it. Yeah.
I think any grad student should have to read it before they talk in class. But but this is his point. He says, bullshitting is not lying, because the liar has to actually know the truth to cover it up, right? To prevaricate and stuff, you have to know what's going. Whereas the bullshitter, if something he says winds up course or she says corresponds to truth, okay, that's great. It's so performative. And so he quotes Augustine somewhere saying and then he says, this is why the liar is morally superior to the bullshitter, because the liar at least has to know the truth to cover it up. And at least there's some derivative virtue from at least familiarizing yourself. Whereas the bullshitter you don't require any acquaintance with the truth, right? Because who cares, right? It is just utterly performative. So does this make you're somebody that studied intellectual history, that teaches a class about truth after Nietzsche, all this stuff. Does it make you want to wish you were a hedge fund manager, that you would have studied finance or something like that and made real money?
I have never wished I were a hedge fund manager. I would be a terrible hedge fund manager. I only ever overpay for things. So no, it hasn't made, but it has made me feel sometimes like I'm tearing my hair out. But no, I mean, in some ways, the only moments of some kind of existential calm I have are the moments when I'm in the classroom and I feel like, okay, I know what to do. I know what to do. I know what we should read. I can curate the reading list. I can turn students' attention here. I know how to phrase the questions. I don't have magical answers to the questions, but at least I know how to start with the questions. But again, I'm talking from the point of view of this is the only thing I know how to do. This is what I've done my whole
Do
adult life.
students give you hope? Does interacting with students make you a more hopeful person?
It does. It does. And I feed off that energy very much, from being in the classroom, because it is a moment where I feel like I am doing something. Like we can sit down with a text and we can really take it apart and we can discuss it. And people are capable of focusing and they're capable of thinking. And it doesn't happen enough in one's everyday life, but you can create conditions for it. And there's after the 2016 elections, I decided I was going to scrap all my teaching plans that I had for the next semesters, and we were going to all go back and do an intellectual history of totalitarianism. Grad students, undergrad students, we were going to go back. We were going to read Hannah Arendt. We're going to read Origins of Totalitarianism from the beginning to the end. We're going to read Viktor Klemperer. We're going to read Czeslaw Miłosz. We're going to read the classics. And there was a moment when I was teaching a class of first-year students. And we got to a part in Origins of Totalitarianism where Hannah Arendt is talking about the mob coming out in the historical stage, and the masses are finally engaged in politics, but they come out led not by the liberals who had expected that was what happened, but rather by the mob, and the bourgeoisie secretly takes delight in having the curtain pulled on their own hypocrisy. And there's a moment with my first year students, these are like they're 18, 19, one of them said, "Oh my God, Professor Shore, she's talking about us. I can't believe it. She's talking about us. How could she know?" So those are, they're moments you really appreciate. And I do, like one of the first year students who actually is from Kiev, who I had in a seminar on the war in Ukraine, the problem of evil last year, just wrote this great piece about
the war in Ukraine and the problem of evil. I'm surprised no one's ever written a folk song with that title.
So you can. Now that can be your next thing.
I'm curious. We had this experience recently in this country where everybody knew someone if you weren't in Southern California, you knew someone that was, and that was impacted by the fires, and we all felt it. It was, in the age of mass media, it's something kind of new in world history where you can see and feel tragedies that you're not immediately geographically connected to, right? You, for the past couple of years, people, you've written about them in your book about the revolution of 2014. You know people intimately in the Ukraine. I can't imagine what this is like for you and the stories you hear. And in this horrendous war. And I'm just wondering, since the Oval Office experience, have you talked to anyone in Ukraine about that?
Yes, no, I definitely have. The first thing I said is, I'm so sorry. Like I'm so like, I feel so ashamed. And, it's not obviously not that I voted for this man. It's not that, but we have failed. We, the opposition, have failed. I, as an American, feel co-implicated. I'm getting these very nice messages back saying, Marci, we know it's not your fault. We know there are still good Americans. It's very sweet.
You're one of the good ones.
My friend Jirko Prohaska sent me a piece he had just written in German, which is brilliant, about Trump as the Joker of the apocalypse. No, I'm constantly in touch with people, and to some extent, it's when I talk to audiences about Ukraine, one of the things I first put on the table is I say, I'm not Ukrainian. I come from an American Jewish community. I'm definitely not part of any kind of Ukrainian diaspora, but I'm also not a neutral observer, because I'm an East Europeanist. I spent my whole adult life engaged with this part of the world, and these are my friends and colleagues who are being slaughtered. And so when it's people personally, you can't be indifferent. I mean, and if you are indifferent, clearly something's wrong with you. If people like Putin and Trump are completely indifferent to the lives of other people, that's what makes them psychopaths. And that's what gives them an enormous advantage, because when other people's lives mean nothing to you, then you have a free hand. But I always put on the table that I'm not a neutral observer, because I know these people, and so you feel their lives when they're people in a different way. And that distinction between people personally and people you don't know personally, I think that cuts much more deeply than any kind of religious, ethnic, national identification. Your friends are your friends.
I'm curious. So President Zelensky has said he's not a particularly religious guy, but he is Jewish, and I'm wondering how. Do you see, as somebody who is acquainted well with the region, do you see how his Judaism shapes in any way? I mean, is that how important is that for contextualizing who he is? Because he's not a religiously observant guy.
Yes, no, it's a fascinating question. I wrote a piece on this for the Jewish Review of Books early after the full-scale invasion, that there's just layer upon layer of kind of historical irony going on here. One of which is the trope that Jews had always been somehow the nerdy and emasculated, and now suddenly, you have this Ukrainian Jews stepping into the role of Winston Churchill in the 21st century in a way nobody ever could have imagined. I would say Judaism, almost nothing. Jewishness, in a cultural sense, something. But I don't know that I'm what he represents to me with that Jewishness, in some sense, above all, the fact that it's a total non-issue in Ukraine. It's something that Americans are much more fascinated by than Ukrainians. To me, represents the fact that Ukraine has matured into a civic nation.
Let me ask this as we wrap up the conversation. I'm wondering, what is one thing that our listeners could read or listen to that would put some meat on the bones of if they're feeling lost, if they're feeling like, oh my gosh, what's going on in the White House, Ukraine, Europe, what's going on? What's one thing they could read that would be helpful for them?
There's a great Ukrainian podcast series in English called Ukraine World. That is curated, and often hosted by the philosopher Vladimir Yermolenko and the philosopher literary scholar Tatiana Ogarkova. And they're very, very good at explaining things. Natalia Gumenyuk, who is, just an extraordinary war correspondent and journalist who has also been doing war crimes research, and who has experience not only covering war in Ukraine, but also covering, war. She covered the Arab Spring. She's covered multiple American elections. She often writes, for The Guardian or for Rolling Stone, and she is absolutely sober and very, very clear. So yeah, there are a lot of people who are doing very good work. Who are writing things that are very clear, that are easy to follow. That there's a couple people on Twitter and Blue Sky, Ilya Ponomarenko and let me see, Anton Gerashenko, who are also very, writing in English, very easy to follow.
Marci, thank you so much for spending some time talking with me. You are very clear. You are easy to follow. And next time you come back, we'll talk about European intellectual history after Nietzsche.
Oh, thank you so much, Scott. And I love your Trump imitations. They're brilliant.
Thanks so much. Appreciate you coming on.
Thanks.